Hey everyone, it's Allie, and with Path of Exile 2 coming out soon, I know there's going to be a lot of new players who've never played the game before, as well as there being a lot of people from PoE 1 who aren't necessarily caught up to date with every single change in PoE 2. I wanted to make a video today going over some what I think are important things to keep in mind as you're playing your first character, just so you don't potentially end up breaking your character or potentially having a really bad time on launch. One thing I want to preface this is to say that there's going to be no meta, at least to begin with in the game. Everything is assumed to be somewhat balanced around the same power level, and pretty much everything should be viable. There's no rush to get to endgame or to do something before everyone else or to amass a large amount of money. So whatever plans you have or whatever concepts of build you have are just fine, and you should honestly just play whatever you want to play and have fun with it. With that said, one of the biggest mistakes I personally made when I first started playing PoE 1, and given how expansive of a game PoE 2 is, you're most likely going to be able to potentially make the same exact mistake, is that you want to keep the scope of your build small. What I mean by that is try to stick to something basic, such as maybe a self-caster that shoots fireballs that might either potentially crit, or you might potentially play them as hit-based and then you ignite off it, or potentially some sort of melee character that's doing bleeds, some sort of bow build that might be playing some sort of poison skill. While I say to keep it simple, there's going to be a lot of combo abilities in PoE 2 where you're probably going to want to use 2 or 3 different skills at once in your build. That's completely fine to do. What I mean is to potentially not play some sort of fire ignite build, but at the same time have some sort of heavy focus onto cold skills, or potentially play some sort of two-handed mace build that's bleeding and then swapping over to a crossbow that's doing lightning damage. Things like that, while I'm sure are going to potentially work out in PoE 2, especially given we have the new weapon swapping system that's giving you extra passive points that allow you to potentially do things like that. We don't know enough about the system and just how flexible builds are going to be walking into PoE 2 to where it's probably better to just stick to one damage type and to heavily build into it than to specifically play multiple damage types at once. There'll definitely be builds that want to play multiple damage types, but just to begin, a good general advice in PoE has always been try to only do one thing at a time. That is also going to extend to weapons. While PoE 2 is definitely giving you the ability to play multiple different weapon types at once, try to do something like being a spellcaster that has a wand, while at the same time swapping over to a crossbow might not necessarily work out, simply because the nodes that you're most likely going to want for a crossbow are going to be on the complete opposite side of the tree from any sort of spellcasting nodes that you're going to want for your wand. There's going to be a little bit of play where it might make sense to play multiple things like that, such as a monk that can pick up both the melee related staff nodes as well as maybe some spellcasting nodes and play some sort of hybrid build like that. But don't, for example, try to play a monk with like a two-handed mace when all of the two-handed and physical stuff would be completely on the opposite side of the tree. Speaking of the passive tree, another really important thing to keep in mind is to try to think about how you're actually pathing to the passive tree. Now, you are going to be able to respec your points with gold, which, given how gold has gone in PoE 1, should be pretty plentiful while you're leveling through the campaign, meaning respecing and changing your mind shouldn't be too big of an issue. But while you're pathing around, the best way I could put it is to not make artwork out of your passive tree. For example, here would be a example of how some good sort of pathing would look, where you're trying to not pick up as many travel nodes as possible, and you're trying to path through as many clusters of notables that give you some sort of benefit from your build. What I mean by bad pathing would be something like this, where you have multiple paths that converge together, where you aren't really optimally spending your points. I'm not trying to tell you to 100% min-max everything, but try to at least keep an efficient path as you're going through, as typically the travel nodes are not very good, while the clusters of nodes that focus on a specific archetype are where most of the power and the passive points are going to be. Further on, I would recommend to not try to pick every single keystone on the passive tree. I know there are going to be a lot of keystones that are very interesting, such as Giant's Blood, that allows you to dual wield 2 weapons at the same time. But for example, if you're trying to make a melee build in the bottom left of the tree and you really want Giant's Blood and you might want to go up to Blood Magic, for example, it might be a little bit too far out of the way to go get something like Ball Pact. And some builds, it might be completely worth it to spend the 10 or 15 points to get all the way over there and get that keystone. But if it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to your builds, don't go out of your way to get it. General advice is most builds are going to have somewhere around 1 to 3 keystones. They're going to heavily synergize with their build. And very few builds are going to have something like 5 or 6 keystones that they're going to really, really want. To further add on to this, you're going to really want to focus on getting some defensive layers in your build. One very important thing to keep in mind for PoE 2 is that if you die during a boss or if you die during an endgame map, you completely lose it and you either have to restart the boss or you have to go to a completely new map. Dying in PoE 2 is extremely punishing, so focusing on getting some defensive layers is going to be very important. Based off of where you are in the passive tree, your defensive layers are going to be kind of themed around what's over there. For example, the top of the tree is going to heavily want you to go into Energy Shield and something like Energy Shield Recharge, while someone in the bottom left of the tree might want to potentially go block or life regen or armor and mostly focus on those things. You could potentially be a bottom left tree and get Energy Shield, but that's honestly not going to really be ideal, as you're either not going to be able to get enough nodes to really scale your Energy Shield while picking up eventually physical or melee nodes in bottom left. And you might have been better off just simply focusing on what is available to you in your part of the tree. Some examples of this being a melee build at the bottom left are most likely going to want to focus on armor, leech, regeneration, and potentially block. Builds in the top of the tree are mostly going to want to focus on energy shield regen, energy shield leech, while builds in the bottom right might focus on something like life and evasion rating. There's a little bit of play, and there are some interesting mechanics between each of these three general areas of the tree. For example, the top left of the tree has a mix of both armor, block, and energy shield nodes, allowing you to mix and match a little bit. And it might be worth it in some cases to go a little bit of a hybrid setup. For example, a monk that might go both energy shield and evasion at the same time, as a lot of nodes in their area of the tree are going to allow you to synergize like that. No matter what you play, another very important thing to keep in mind is that you need some sort of recovery in your build. You might be able to have quite a lot of things that either allow you to take big hits at once or make you pretty tanky. But no matter what, you're going to have to heal back up once you do get hit. There's going to be three main ways for you to achieve this. Now, there's going to be a few other niche ways of getting your recovery back, but in general, most builds are either going to want to focus on regen, leech, or recharge. Recharge is mostly going to be something for energy shield at the top of the tree, but if you're somewhere in the top left of the tree, you could potentially also focus on energy shield recharge as a life build and play something like Eternal Youth, for example. Someone in the bottom left of the tree might instead want to focus on regen and leech instead, and I wouldn't necessarily try to focus on only one of them. It's typically pretty good to get two of the three ways of recovering rather than just simply relying on one. An example of this would be if you're only focusing on leech and you're in an area with a bunch of debuffs on the ground that do damage to you, but you have nothing to hit. Your leech doesn't really do anything, and as you're walking over a bunch of fire on the ground, you're just going to quickly die. If you had a little bit of regen at the same time, the ground dots would still hurt you, but you'd be able to recover some of it with your regen as you walk through it until you find something to hit or until you're out of them to where your regen brings you back up. Moving on to gear. Now, this is going to be fairly simplistic for most builds, but just how we talked about for the passive tree, how you want to focus on something that makes sense in your area, the gear is also going to have different defensive layers on them that can synergize with what you're doing. For example, if you're playing a top build where you want to get a lot of energy shield, you are going to want to use as much energy shield gear as possible to further make your energy shield be higher. If you're playing a bottom left build where you're getting a lot of armor nodes, you're going to want a bunch of armor gear to further multiply the total amount of armor that you have. For the stats you're going to want to actually find on the gear itself, the general advice for pretty much all builds in the game is to just find yourself gear with life and resistances on it. That is pretty much the big backbone of every single build, where you need to be res capped and you want to find as much life as possible to increase your health pool as much as you can. There's plenty of other really useful mods that are going to spawn on gear that are going to potentially either be really important for your build or completely useless. But no matter what, a good piece of gear in PoE has always been something with life and resistances on it. Obviously, if you're playing an energy shield build, for example, then instead of wanting life and resistances, you'd want energy shield and resistances. But as long as you keep that in mind and you try to upgrade whatever piece of gear you have with more piece of gear that have life and resistances, you should have a pretty easy time. To further add on to this, a new system that's going to be included for gear are going to be runes. Runes are going to be items that you're going to presumably find very often as you're killing enemies, which will then go into sockets under gear that will give you stats based off of the rune type and based off of where it's equipped. This can be a great source of resistances if you are, for example, 20 cold resistance off of hitting the cap of 75, where you can fit one or two cold res runes into your build to pretty much completely fix any sort of cold res issues you have. These runes are going to have quite a lot of different stats on them, so it'll be easy for you to mix and match them for whatever you need. And between this and using any sort of crafting currency that comes along your way, such as exalted orbs, which are going to be super plentiful and easy for you to just use on your gear willy-nilly to get some free stats, you shouldn't have too much of an issue progressing through the campaign into the endgame. That's pretty much everything that we have to go over in this video. If you have any further questions or want any further explanation on anything that we talked in here, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below. and I'd be more than happy to help you with any questions. I also stream on Twitch every single day, so feel free to come by Twitch and ask me your questions there. Or if you simply want to come and hang out with all the cuties, I'd be more than happy to see you there as a part of our community. With all that said, I'm super excited for Path of Exile 2 coming out in a few days. I hope to see you all cuties in the next video.